Have you ever wondered if the famous serpent in Genesis was really a serpent? What if I told you that the answer, hidden in the original Hebrew, could shake up everything you've ever heard about the origin of evil in the Bible? Don't worry. This isn't a conspiracy theory or a modern invention. We're talking about something much deeper, much older, and much more disturbing. The kind of revelation that was there all along, but is only now beginning to be revealed. The story of Adam, Eve, and the serpent is one of the best-known passages in the Bible, and also one of the most misinterpreted. Maybe because it's convenient to keep certain things hidden, or maybe because, to understand what's really written, you have to go back to the beginning, to the original language, to the root of the words, to the sacred subtext where the mystery lies. Genesis chapter 3. The setting is the Garden of Eden, the perfect paradise, where the first man and woman live in harmony with God. But there, among the trees, a character appears who would change the destiny of humanity: the serpent. In many versions of the Bible, the text says that it was more crafty than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. A talking snake, who tempts Eve and tricks her into eating the forbidden fruit. Right? Wrong. Because in the original Hebrew, the word used for serpent is not just snake. It's Nachash. And this is where things start to get dark. Nachash is a mysterious word. Commonly translated as serpent, it comes from the root Nachash, which means to divine, to whisper incantations, to practice sorcery. That's right. The serpent of Genesis was not just a creepy-crawly creature. It was an entity endowed with intelligence, speech, cunning, and perhaps supernatural power. In some Old Testament contexts, the word Nachash refers to practitioners of magic or enchanters. It's not a zoological term, it's a symbolic term. And in biblical Hebrew, symbols matter, because they carry layers of meaning that are lost when we translate them literally. When we read serpent, we think of a reptile. But when a Hebrew read Nachash, he might have been seeing something much more dangerous, something spiritual. And it doesn't stop there. Some scholars believe that Nachash may be linked to a fallen celestial figure, a being who had access to Eden, who spoke clearly, who knew God's commandments, who was envious of creation, and who used knowledge, not force, to corrupt. Does that sound like anyone? That's right. There are those who believe that the serpent was, in fact, a manifestation of Lucifer before the total fall, or, more precisely, a spiritual entity using the form of a charming being to deceive. We're not talking about just any snake. We're talking about a conscious being, a manipulator, a strategist of temptation, a veiled adversary. But how did this go unnoticed for so long? The answer lies in the history of Bible translations. The original Hebrew Bible was written with words laden with poetic ambiguity. But when the Greek translators of the Septuagint in the 3rd century BC were faced with the term Nachash, they opted for something simpler, ophis, which in Greek means snake. And this term was inherited by the Latin translations and then by the modern versions. And so the symbolism was lost. The seductive spiritual entity became a talking snake. The mythical narrative, rich in spiritual layers, was flattened into a children's fable. But the Hebrew text remained intact, whispering its secret, waiting to be rediscovered. Do you see what this means? If the serpent was not a literal serpent, then original sin was not caused by a cunning reptile, but by a spiritual being, a fallen angel, a demon, a watchman from the ancient heavens. Scholars differ, but they all agree on one thing: Nachash cannot be understood simply as an animal. And that changes everything. Because by changing the identity of the tempter, we also change the weight of the temptation. The serpent was not just any creature from Eden. He was the embodiment of rebellion, an echo of the pride that led other heavenly beings to their downfall. And maybe, just maybe, he holds the key to understanding evil in the biblical narrative as something that begins in the heavens and only manifests itself on earth. Now that you know that the serpent of Genesis may not be a simple snake, let's dive deeper. Because what's at stake here is not just a question of semantics. It's the very nature of evil. The book of Genesis doesn't describe just any animal. It describes a being with articulate speech, strategic reasoning, and deep theological knowledge. What's more, someone who had access to Eden and who was not immediately destroyed by God after his act of deception. This raises a question that has been provoking theologians, scholars, and mystics for centuries. Who was this Nachash, really? To answer this, we need to go beyond Genesis. We need to explore other ancient texts that complement, or echo, this same mystery. One such text is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28. There, God addresses the king of Tyre, but in a symbolic way, referring to someone who was in Eden, the garden of God, covered with precious stones, perfect in his ways until iniquity was found in him. This description, it seems, refers not only to a human king, but to a celestial entity who fell through pride. Many scholars interpret this text as an allusion to the fall of Lucifer. And guess who was also in Eden? Yes, Nachash. The connection between the serpent and Satan appears most explicitly in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 12 verse 9, John writes, "And the great dragon was cast out, that ancient serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world." Here, the ancient serpent is clearly identified as Satan. But note, this is centuries after Genesis. This means that the direct association between serpent and devil was solidified over time. In Genesis, the text does not use the word Satan. It uses only Nachash, which brings us to another revelation. The devil, as a concrete, personified figure, evolves throughout the scriptures. In Eden, he was still just the whisper of doubt. But what if the Nachash was more than a fallen spiritual entity? What if he represented a category of celestial beings who interacted with humans? This is where the so-called Watchers or Bnei HaElohim come into play, the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6, who are said to have come down to earth, taken human wives and fathered the Nephilim. These beings, according to the book of Enoch, an apocryphal text, but widely used in Jesus' time, were responsible for corrupting humanity with forbidden knowledge. Astrology, weapons, witchcraft, knowledge that was not meant to be revealed. A type of wisdom that leads to the fall. Just like the forbidden fruit. What connects all of this? The desire to know. The search for knowledge beyond what is permitted. Eve was not tempted by hunger. She was tempted by the promise of becoming like God. The Nachash said, "You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." That is the bait. The same speech of original pride. The same poison that contaminated the rebellious angels. The same thirst for elevation that leads to the fall. What if the Nachash was one of those angels? A bearer of corrupted wisdom? A transmitter of adulterated light? Interestingly, the word Lucifer comes from the Latin lux ferae, the bearer of light. In Isaiah 14 verse 12 we read, "How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning." This passage, associated with an earthly king, has been read by Christian tradition as a description of the fall of Lucifer. a being who desired to place himself above the Most High, who desired light, but without obedience, who wanted to be God, without being holy. And see how it all connects. The Nachash offers light, the knowledge of good and evil. But it is a light that leads to shame, exile, and spiritual death. It is the light of deception, the light that shines too brightly and blinds. And here we come to another crucial point, the punishment of the Nachash. After sin, God declares, "Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." This sounds like a description of a snake. But think about it. If the Nachash were originally a spiritual entity, this going on its belly could be symbolic. A humiliation, a fall from heavenly status to a lower state, a transformation of glory into dust. More than a physical curse, it is an ontological condemnation. The being that wanted to rise now crawls. Are you beginning to see the depth of this? What seemed like a fable about a snake and an apple is actually a cosmic tale of pride, fall, and spiritual corruption. Eden was not just a garden. It was the stage for an invisible war. The serpent was not a reptile. It was a whisper of rebellion. And the fruit was not just food. It was the promise of a power that could not be given, but was taken. But if Eden was indeed the stage for a spiritual battle, a subtle field where heavenly forces fought for the human heart, then the serpent of Genesis 3 is not just a symbol of deception. It is the first biblical record of the eternal conflict between light and darkness, between truth and seduction, between trust and doubt. And here comes one of the greatest ironies of the text. The serpent does not lie outright. He distorts. He manipulates what is true. Knowledge did indeed come. Eyes did indeed open. But the consequences were devastating, because when light comes unprepared, it burns instead of illuminating. In the original Hebrew, the verb used for "the eyes were opened" is vitipakokna, coming from the root pakach, which literally means to be unveiled, to be exposed. In other words, what happened to Adam and Eve after the fruit was not just a spiritual awakening, but a stripping away of innocence, a raw and bitter revelation of human vulnerability. They saw, but what they saw was their own nakedness, shame, separation. That which was full and pure now became exposed and wounded. This is what happens when one accesses wisdom outside of time, when one pierces the veil without being invited. And speaking of veils, many rabbis and Torah scholars understand Genesis not as a literal account of physical events, but as a mystical code, loaded with symbolic layers. According to Jewish tradition, there are 4 levels of interpretation of Scripture, known as pards: the literal meaning, peshet, the allegorical, remez, the moral, darash, and the mystical, sard. At the sard level, the deepest, the serpent, represents a force that resides within the human being itself, an inner drive that defies limits, that whispers shortcuts, that seduces with quick promises. The Nachash, in this case, is an archetype, a reflection of the shadow. And here's something that will blow your mind. Gematria, the Kabbalistic system that associates numbers with Hebrew letters, reveals a disturbing curiosity. The word Nachash has the numerical value 358. And do you know what other word also adds up to 358? Mashiach. That's right. The Messiah. The promised liberator. How is it possible that the same number represents both the tempter and the redeemer? The answer lies in the symbolic tension between true light and illusory light, between the knowledge that saves and that which enslaves. The Messiah is the one who brings wisdom with redemption. The Nachash is the one who offers wisdom without mercy. He is the distorted mirror of the sacred. This duality is no coincidence. It is part of the biblical mystery. Because the history of salvation does not begin at Calvary, it begins in Eden. And the Messiah, according to Christianity, is precisely the one who comes to restore what was lost in that garden. The serpent bruised the heel of humanity. The Messiah crushes its head. This prophecy, recorded in Genesis 3 verse 15, is known as the Proto-Evangelium, that is, the first announcement of the gospel. God says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." This is the beginning of the plan of redemption, an open war. But look at the tragic beauty of this sentence. God does not directly curse Adam or Eve. He curses the ground because of Adam. He multiplies the pains of childbirth because of Eve. But to the serpent, he promises total destruction. Because the serpent represents not just an isolated act of disobedience, but the origin of spiritual corruption. It is the channel through which pride entered, the crack in paradise, the poison that still runs through the veins of humanity today. But it is also against it that the promise of victory arises. And if there is promise, there is hope. What the serpent destroyed, the Messiah rebuilds. What was contaminated, he purifies. What became death, he transforms into life. The tree of knowledge brought the fall. But the cross, called by some church fathers the new tree, brought restoration. In Eden, man stretched out his hand to eat. On Golgotha, Jesus stretched out his arms to save. The serpent whispered deceit. The Son cried out truth. And it is in this cosmic connection between the first garden and the last sacrifice that the Bible comes full circle. But to understand this cycle, we must read beyond the words. We must go back to Hebrew, to the Nachash, to the initial whisper. Now that you understand that the serpent was not a literal animal, but an entity, a symbol, a spiritual force, perhaps you will also realize that the battle has never been just external. Since Eden, it has been fought within us. The real battlefield is the human heart, and the real forbidden fruit is the one we desire before its time. If the battlefield is the heart, then the serpent has never been just a distant character in the past. It is a living symbol, pulsating in every choice, in every thought, in every temptation that invites us to take for ourselves that which is not yet ready. The Nachash, whether it is a spiritual entity, an archetypal force, or a representation of the adversary, continues to whisper today. And its whispers are not shouted. They are soft, persuasive, rational. They always come with a convincing logic. God is hiding something from you. You deserve more. You can be like him. This is the real poison. Doubt masquerading as legitimate desire. And look, it is no coincidence that the serpent approaches Eve, and not Adam. The Hebrew text gives no indication that Eve was weaker or more vulnerable, but she represents sensitivity, intuition, and listening, and precisely for this reason, she becomes the direct target of subtle manipulation. The temptation is not physical. It is verbal. It is intellectual. The serpent does not force Eve. He talks. He asks questions. He raises hypotheses. He uses a gentle tone. He asks, "Did God really say so?" It is the strategy of deception, to plant doubt in order to reap rebellion. And if this happened in Eden, why wouldn't it happen today? But let's move on. Because there's another detail that the Hebrew reveals, and that modern translations hide. When God says to the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed," the word used for seed is zera, which can mean either seed or lineage. And this ambiguity is powerful, Because the prophecy of Genesis 3 verse 15 is saying that there will be a lineage that will fight against the lineage of the serpent. A lineage of light against a lineage of darkness. And this is where the scriptures take on an almost epic tone, as if an intergenerational conflict is underway, and we are in the middle of it. This idea of the serpent's lineage is echoed in other parts of the Bible. Jesus, for example, when confronting the Pharisees, says in John 8 verse 44, "You are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you want to do." He was talking to religious leaders, to men who followed the Torah, but who had lost the spirit of truth. They had a form of godliness, but their hearts were corrupt, and Jesus identifies in them the spiritual DNA of the Nachash, the seed of deception, the desire to appear righteous, but to dominate, to speak of God, but to act like gods. In other words, the serpent does not manifest itself only in temptation. It manifests itself in religiosity without love, in faith without transformation, in law without compassion. And do you know what's even scarier? In Revelation 12, the serpent reappears, this time as a great red dragon. The text says that it pursues the woman who is about to give birth. For many theologians, this woman represents both Israel and the church, and the dragon tries to devour her, to interrupt the birth of the promise. In other words, the War of Eden continues. The serpent that tempted Eve now tries to prevent the birth of the Messiah. The enmity declared in Genesis continues until the last book of the Bible, and the clash between light and darkness, between the serpent and the seed, only ends when Christ triumphs, crushing the dragon's head once and for all. But let us return to Eden, because there is still a mystery that few notice: the name of the tree. It was not the tree of evil. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge was complete, total, but it was not time for it to be revealed. God never prohibited knowledge. He prohibited haste. He prohibited the breaking of trust. He prohibited the replacement of relationship with independence. And the Nachash exploited precisely this gap. He offered knowledge before its time. He accelerated the process. He stole the light. And the price was darkness. And here is a profound spiritual key. Everything we receive outside of God's time, even if it is good, destroys us. Knowledge can be a blessing or a curse. Power can be an instrument of healing or of domination. Light can guide or blind, and the Nachash knew this. That is why he offers not a poison, but a fruit. Beautiful, pleasant, desirable, because evil does not always present itself as monstrosity. Many times it disguises itself as a promise of progress, of evolution, of autonomy. But what happens right after sin? God seeks man. Where are you? This divine question is one of the most moving in the Bible. Not because God didn't know where Adam was, but because Adam no longer knew where he himself was. He had lost his way. The serpent took him away from himself, from his origin, from his identity, from his place. And just like that day, God continues to ask today, where are you? Where have you been hiding? What have you believed that wasn't true? What subtle lie have you dressed up as the absolute truth? If the serpent of Genesis was no mere snake, then the story of the fall is no nursery rhyme. It is a mirror, a warning, a revelation, and maybe, just maybe, the same Nachash that whispered in Eve's ear is still trying to whisper in ours. We have reached the final moment of this journey, and if you have come this far, it is because something inside you has also realized this story is not just about the past. It pulses. It breathes. It speaks about now, about us. Because what Genesis offers us is not just the origin of evil, it is the anatomy of temptation. It is the X-ray of deception. It is a spiritual map of what happens every time we exchange trust for doubt, obedience for ambition, intimacy with God for the promise of control. And the one who plants this exchange is the Nachash, the same one who acts in silence, who disguises himself as logic, who has a sweet voice but corrupt intentions. Now, understand one thing. Eden was not lost because of a bite. It was lost because of a choice. And that choice is still before us every day. Who is your counselor? Who is whispering in your heart? The Spirit of God, or the disguised logic of the serpent? Because the real battle is not external. It happens in the mind, in the most sacred place of your being. And Nachash knows this. He does not need strength, only space, an unresolved thought, a fed resentment, a desire out of time. He enters through the cracks, and before he knows it, he has already planted his fruit. But here's the gospel. If there is a Nachash, there is also a Redeemer. If there are whispers of deception, there is also a voice of truth. And that voice was made flesh. The Messiah didn't just come to crush the serpent's head. He came to undo everything it had tried to build within us. Jesus is the perfect reverse of the serpent. Where it lied, he revealed. Where it divided, he united. Where it wounded, he healed. Where it offered knowledge without wisdom, he brought wisdom with grace. Where it promised to be like God, he, being God, became man. And that is why the gospel is not a religion. It is a restoration, a return of the lost Eden. Not the geographical Eden, but the inner Eden. The state of communion, of complete identity, of absolute trust. The serpent planted fear. Christ plants love. The serpent created shame. Christ covers us with glory. The serpent cast us out. Christ invites us back. But to return, we must recognize where we were seduced, where we believed in falsehood, where we fed the serpent within us. Because yes, it continues to speak. But the choice is now yours. And what's more, the story doesn't end in Genesis. It begins again in Revelation. Remember the dragon we saw earlier? In chapter 20 of Revelation we read, "And the devil, who deceived them, was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, and will be tormented day and night forever and ever." The end is written. The serpent will be defeated. The cycle will be ended. The seed of the woman will win. But until that day comes, the battle continues. Not with swords, but with choices. Not with armies, but with daily decisions. With open spiritual eyes. With renewed discernment. With living faith. And now that you know that Nachash was never just a serpent, perhaps you will understand that the Bible was never a simple book. It is an invitation to depth. It is a sacred code that opens itself to those who thirst for truth. Ancient Hebrew is not just a language. It is a portal, an echo of voices that knew that words shape realities, that names carry destinies, that letters hide secrets. And perhaps the greatest secret is this: the serpent is still active, but so is the promise of redemption. So from now on, when you hear or read about this serpent of Genesis, don't just imagine a slithering animal. Imagine a spiritual intelligence, a seductive entity, an archetype of rebellion. And most importantly, remember that he was unmasked, that his plan was exposed, that his head was crushed by the one who conquered where Adam fell, who refused the shortcut, who resisted temptation, who exchanged the lost garden for a new garden, that of the empty tomb. Because it is there, on that resurrection morning, that the true Eden begins to bloom again. And you? Will you continue to feed the serpent's whispers? Or will you listen to the call of truth? Eden may have been closed, but the door has been reopened. And it is not an idea, a doctrine, or a symbol. It has a name. It has a voice. And it still calls. Today. Now. Because the serpent's secret has been revealed. But the invitation to life remains.